A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at my workflow logs this morning and it hit me that I haven't actually used a dedicated chatbot interface in nearly 3 weeks. Everything is happening in the background now, through the various API hooks and agentic layers we have set up. It feels like the era of talking to a box on a screen is finally, officially over.
It really is. We have moved into what people are calling the multi-surface operating layer. It is less about a product you visit and more about the substrate your entire professional life sits on. Herman Poppleberry here, by the way, and I have been knee-deep in the technical documentation for the new releases from the Big Three all week. We are talking about a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize computing. It is no longer about the chat, it is about the agentic substrate.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that shift. He wants us to look past the marketing vibes and the multimodal flashy stuff to see what actually differentiates GPT-5.4, Gemini 3.1, and Claude 4.6 under the hood. Beyond just being really good at coding, how do these models actually vary in their architectural DNA and their instructional personalities? Because as of late March 2026, the choice you make determines the very logic of your automated workflows.
It is a great time to ask because the convergence we saw last year has started to fracture into very distinct design philosophies. While everyone moved to mixture of experts architectures, the way they route those experts and the way they prioritize reasoning versus speed has diverged significantly. We are seeing a real split between the thinking models and the instant models, and that has massive implications for how you build your AI stack.
Let's start with the current landscape as of late, March 2026. We have OpenAI with their new Thinking and Pro models. Google DeepMind just dropped Gemini 3.1 Pro in Flash, and Anthropic came out with Claude 4.6 Opus and Sonnet earlier this month. On the surface, they all seem like they can do everything, but the benchmarks tell a more nuanced story. We are seeing OpenAI consolidate their O-series reasoning with the Codex line, while Google is pushing recursive memory and Anthropic is giving us granular effort controls.
They really do. If you look at something like the SWE Bench Verified, which measures how these models handle real-world GitHub issues, Claude 4.6 Opus is currently leading the pack at 80.8%. Gemini 3.1 Pro is right on its heels at 80.6%, while GPT 5.4 is trailing a bit at 77.2%. That is a massive shift from 2 years ago when OpenAI was the undisputed king of coding. It shows that the competition has not just caught up, they have specialized.
That 77.2% for GPT 5.4 is interesting because OpenAI has been leaning so hard into the reasoning side of things with their O-series consolidation. You would think that more thinking time would lead to higher scores on a benchmark like SWE Bench. Sam Altman has been very vocal about prioritizing novel science and agentic execution over just having a model that sounds like a person.
You would think so, but the issue often comes down to the architecture of the mixture of experts routing. Claude 4.6 Opus is rumored to be a 744 billion parameter model, but it only uses about 40 billion active parameters per token. Compare that to the open weights baseline of Llama 4 Maverick, which uses 17 billion active parameters out of 400 billion total. Anthropic seems to have found a way to make their 40 billion active parameters more specialized for high-stakes instruction following. This is what we call sparse activation, efficiency.
When you say specialized, are you talking about how the model actually selects which experts to engage for a specific prompt? Because that seems to be the secret sauce everyone is fighting over right now.
That is exactly it. In a mixture of expert system, you have a router that decides which subnetworks or experts are best suited for the incoming data. Anthropic has always had this philosophy of careful instruction following. Their routing seems optimized to minimize what we call the drift of intent. When you give Claude a complex refactoring task across a massive repository, it stays anchored to your original constraints better than GPT 5.4, which sometimes tries to be a bit too creative or conversational. It is the difference between a model that wants to please you and a model that wants to be correct.
I have noticed that. GPT 5.4 feels like it is trying to be a collaborator, whereas Claude feels like a very high-level architect who follows the blueprint to the letter. But we have to talk about the thinking latency. OpenAI's move to bake the reasoning process into a 10 to 30 second pause before you get an answer has been a huge point of contention this month. Some people love the depth, but others find it unusable for real-time tasks.
It is a fundamental trade-off. OpenAI is prioritizing auditability and deep logic. By forcing the model to generate a hidden chain of thought before the final output, they are essentially giving it a workspace to check its own work. This is why GPT 5.4 is still very strong for brainstorming or when you need a model to navigate a GUI through their operator agent. It needs that pause to simulate the outcomes of its actions. It is literally running internal simulations of what happens if it clicks a certain button in your browser.
But for a real-time agentic workflow, 30 seconds is an eternity. If I have an agent trying to manage a live server migration, I cannot have it sitting there thinking for half a minute while the site is down. This is where Gemini 3.1 Pro seems to be finding its niche. Google seems to be moving away from that long pause while still hitting incredible reasoning numbers.
Google is playing a different game entirely. Gemini 3.1 Pro is the value leader right now at $2 per 1 million input tokens. For comparison, Claude 4.6 Opus is at $5. Google is leveraging their massive internal infrastructure to offer high-level reasoning with almost zero latency. They are also winning on pure logical reasoning. Gemini 3.1 Pro just hit 77.1% on the ARC AG I2 benchmark. That is a record, corn.
For listeners who might not follow the leaderboard wars as closely, the ARC AGI benchmark is basically the gold standard for testing whether a model actually understands logic, or if it is just reciting things it saw in its training data. It is designed to be impossible to memorize. The fact that Google is leading there suggests they have cracked something about fluid intelligence that the others are still struggling with.
It really is a test of fluid intelligence. The fact that Gemini is leading there and also dominating the GPQA Diamond benchmark for graduate level science at 94.3% tells us that Google DeepMind has successfully integrated their AlphaZero style search capabilities into their language models. They are moving toward universal multimodal perception. This is what Demis Hassabis has been calling Project Astra, the idea that the model isn't just processing text, but is seeing the logic of the world.
I want to go back to the hardware side of this for a second because it feels like a turning point. We saw reports this month that OpenAI has started deploying AMD MI450 clusters. That is a huge deal given how much NVIDIA has dominated the space with CUDA. We talked about the competitive pressure in episode 1471, but this feels like a physical manifestation of that pressure.
It is a strategic move to break the CUDA lock-in. Training these trillion-parameter mixture of experts models is becoming prohibitively expensive in terms of energy and hardware margins. By validating the ROCm software stack on AMD hardware, OpenAI is trying to lower the floor for inference costs. If they can get GPT 5.4 running efficiently on AMD clusters, that $2.50 price point might drop even further. It is a hedge against NVIDIA's supply chain volatility.
It also gives them leverage in negotiations. But let's look at the instructional characteristics Daniel asked about. If you are a developer or a researcher, why would you choose one over the other in 2026? If I am writing a massive legal brief, I am probably leaning toward Claude 4.6, right?
Almost certainly. Anthropic introduced these effort controls in the 4.6 release. You can actually toggle between low, medium, and max reasoning depth. If you are doing long-form legal analysis where you need to maintain consistency across a 1 million token context window, setting Claude to max effort ensures it explores every edge case. It has the lowest hallucination rate in massive contexts because its brand voice is inherently more cautious. Dario Amodei has kept that safety-first posture, which is why they are currently negotiating those high-stakes deployment terms with the Pentagon. They want to be the trusted model.
And Google's play for that same researcher would be the context window itself. They are previewing this recursive memory architecture that could theoretically handle 100 million tokens. That is not just a document, that is an entire library of specialized knowledge. We touched on the shift toward multimodal perception in episode 1482, and this recursive memory feels like the logical conclusion of that.
The recursive memory shift is fascinating. Instead of just having a static context window where the model forgets the beginning once it reaches the end, Gemini 3.1 is starting to use a form of dynamic compression. It summarizes and embeds its own previous thoughts into a persistent memory layer. This could eventually make traditional retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, obsolete for many use cases. If the model can just remember the entire history of a project natively, why bother with a separate vector database? It changes the entire architecture of how we build AI applications.
We talked about that shift in episode 1482, how the vector gold rush was moving toward this kind of multimodal optimization. But there is a second-order effect here with the training data. The Ziff Davis lawsuit against OpenAI is a big cloud hanging over the industry right now. It is the elephant in the room when we talk about reasoning capabilities.
The allegation is that OpenAI used proprietary reporting from outlets like CNET to train the reasoning modules of GPT-5. The argument is that they didn't just use the text for facts, but used the structured reporting to teach the model how to think and reason through complex topics. If the courts decide that using high-quality journalism to teach a model how to reason is not fair use, it changes the economics of training data overnight. It forces these companies to move away from the open web and toward expensive licensed data sets.
Which might explain why Anthropic is being so careful with their safety-first posture. They are trying to position themselves as the most legally compliant option, but OpenAI is doubling down on the agentic execution side. With their operator GUI agent, they are basically saying, we do not care if we are slightly behind on a specific coding benchmark because our model can actually use your computer for you. It can open a browser, log into your accounting software, and reconcile your invoices while you sleep.
That is the multi-surface operating layer in action. It is not about the chat box, it is about the model having agency over your digital environment. But I do wonder about the personality of these models. Gemini still feels very much like a Google product. It is deeply integrated into Workspace. If I am in a Google Doc, Gemini 3.1 Pro feels like it knows exactly what my Gmail and my calendar look like. It is what they call ambient retrieval.
It is a different kind of intelligence than the pure text-based reasoning we saw a few years ago. It is native multimodality. Gemini was built to process video, audio, and text simultaneously because it was trained that way from the ground up. If you feed it a video of a technical lecture, it isn't just transcribing the audio. It is watching the slides, noting the speaker's gestures, and correlating that with the tone of voice. That is a level of perception that GPT 5.4 still struggles with, as it often relies on separate vision and audio encoders that are stitched together.
And that brings us to the practical side. If someone is listening to this and trying to decide how to allocate their AI budget for their team, what is the breakdown? Because at $5 per million tokens for Claude Opus, you have to be sure you need that extra precision.
If you are doing high-throughput, low-latency tasks, like customer support bots or real-time data processing, Gemini 3.1 Flash is the winner. It is incredibly cheap and fast. If you are doing high-stakes logic, like auditing smart contracts or complex repository-scale refactoring, you pay the premium for Claude 4.6 Opus. The $5 per million token cost is worth it when a single error could cost you millions.
And GPT 5.4 is the versatile all-rounder. It is the best for rapid prototyping and brainstorming because it has that conversational flexibility that Claude lacks. Claude can sometimes feel a bit stiff or overly formal. GPT 5.4 still has that spark of creativity that makes it feel like a better partner for the early stages of a project. Plus, if you need it to actually execute tasks across different apps, the operator integration is currently superior to what Google or Anthropic have in the wild. It is the Swiss Army knife of the group.
I have noticed that when I ask GPT 5.4 to help me outline a new project, it challenges my assumptions in a way that feels more human. Claude just takes my assumptions and tries to make them work as perfectly as possible. It is the difference between a collaborator and an instrument. Anthropic wants Claude to be a precision instrument. OpenAI wants GPT to be a digital colleague. Both are valid, but you have to know which one you need for the task at hand.
That is a great way to put it. One thing that fascinates me is the shift in how we evaluate these things. We are moving away from these static benchmarks and toward more dynamic, agentic evaluations. How does the model handle a task where the environment changes? This is why we saw that cursor incident in episode 1471, where models were failing because the environment was shifting faster than they could adapt.
It feels like we are reaching a point where the raw intelligence of the big three is starting to plateau, or at least the gap between them is so small that the ecosystem and the specific architectural quirks are what matter most. We are in the deployment era now. It is no longer about how many parameters you have. It is about how efficiently you can use them in a live environment. We covered this a bit in episode 1479 when we looked at the new era of inference speed.
I think we are seeing a plateau in conversational quality, but the ceiling for agentic reliability is still very high. We are not yet at the point where I can give an AI a goal like, build me a fully functional e-commerce site and launch it, and expect it to work 100% of the time without human intervention. But we are getting closer. The 80.8% score on SWE Bench for Claude 4.6 is a massive leap from where we were even a year ago.
It makes me think about the internal routing again. If Claude is using 40 billion active parameters, and it is hitting 80% on these coding tasks, what happens when we figure out how to route those experts even more efficiently? Is there a version of this where a 10 billion active parameter model performs as well as Opus does today?
It is likely. We are seeing a lot of research into what is called sparse activation. Instead of just picking 2 or 3 experts per token, you might have a much more granular selection process. The goal is to minimize the energy cost. The energy consumption of these data centers is becoming a geopolitical issue. If you can get state-of-the-art performance with a fraction of the power, you win the market. This is why the AMD shift is so critical. It is about the power to performance ratio.
That brings us back to the AMD shift. If OpenAI can run these models on more energy-efficient hardware, they can afford to let the model think for longer. That 30-second pause might be annoying for us, but if it saves them 40% on their electricity bill because the model is checking its work instead of just brute-forcing a response, they will take that trade-off every time. It is a business decision as much as a technical one.
And it's not just electricity. It is about the physical footprint of the clusters. Moving away from NVIDIA allows them to diversify their supply chain. It is a hedge against the volatility we have seen in the H100 and B200 markets. If you are building an operating layer for the world, you cannot be dependent on a single hardware vendor.
So, to summarize the instructional characteristics for Daniel, Claude is your careful architect, GPT is your creative collaborator, and Gemini is your hyper-connected, multimodal researcher.
That is a solid breakdown. And don't forget the price points. $2 for Gemini, $2.50 for GPT, and $5 for Claude Opus. If you are a startup, those margins matter. You might find yourself using Gemini for your high-volume tasks and only calling the Claude 4.6 Opus API when you have a truly difficult problem that requires that deep, safety-first reasoning.
It is a multimodal world. No one is using just one substrate anymore. You are building a stack that leverages the strengths of each. It reminds me of the early days of cloud computing, where you had your database on one provider and your front end on another. The AI stack is the new reality for developers in 2026.
The multi-surface operating layer is basically the new OS. You pick your kernel based on what you are trying to compute. If you want to dive deeper into how these models are being used in specific industries, we did a deep dive on the shift toward multimodal perception in episode 1482 that is worth a listen. It provides the context for why Google is winning on those graduate-level science benchmarks.
It is wild to think about how fast this is moving. We are talking about version 4.6 and 5.4, and it feels like just yesterday we were excited about version 3.5. The arc of deprecation is getting shorter every month. We talked about that deprecation trap in episode 808. It is a real challenge for long-term stability in software engineering.
It really is. Developers are constantly having to refactor their code to keep up with the new API capabilities. My recommendation for listeners is to start auditing your own workflows. Are you using a high-priced thinking model for a task that a Flash or Sonnet model could handle just as well? Most of the time, the answer is probably yes. You can save a lot of money by being smart about which expert you are actually calling.
Audit your A. I stack the same way you would audit your cloud bill. The savings can be massive, and with the performance of models like Gemini 3.1 Flash, you aren't really sacrificing much for the majority of everyday tasks. Save the thinking models for the high-stakes logic.
And keep an eye on that recursive memory. If Google can really scale that to 100 million tokens, the way we think about data storage and retrieval is going to change forever. RAG might just become a footnote in AI history.
Well, that is a lot of ground covered. We have looked at the MOE routing, the hardware shifts, the benchmark leaders, and the instructional personalities of the big three. It is a fascinating time to be in this space, even if we are all just trying to keep our heads above water with the release cycles.
It is the weird, fast-moving edge we love. I'm already looking forward to whatever they drop in April. The pace isn't slowing down.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. If you are building agentic substrates or just need some serious compute, check them out.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're finding these deep dives helpful, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us out. It is the best way to help new listeners find the show.
You could also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We will see you next time.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth.